Okay.
All right. We are in these last sessions now trying not only to look at specific readings, but to integrate the multiple themes within the course. And for our agenda today, we've got sections from uh, um, several readings, but the big point of the selections of why we chose these general readings is that they often either illustrate an extreme case, which is the beauty of studying local units, neighborhoods, or cities instead of nation states, for example, because we can compare and find highs and lows and middles, and then see what goes with highs and lows and middles, whether it's percent gay, percent poor, percent black, percent Hispanic, and then what and how do these co-vary with how much are gays and percent black, percent Hispanic correlated with income, for example. For instance, and then as we've discussed, to contrast this with both the general discussion of the broad public and especially the media and political and civic leaders. For instance, one of the most dramatic, the deepest, if you watch the US media, you would think America is still a feudal society, in the sense that feudalism is the source of slavery, and slavery is the driving distinction in black, white, to some degree, Mexican background. And those relationships go back to the feudal era. We're not a post-industrial society, we're a feudal society, is the discussion implicit or sometimes quasi-explicit behind some of these cleavages. So how can we show that we are or are not a feudal society in the US? Um, uh, that's we can look at places that are more, that we have more slavery as a background and less, and we can look at the simple empirical correlations between, say, income or change in income and different factors that may have eroded the workings of slavery. The most obvious was markets, and markets were there in initially, as Max Weber stressed, markets were in cities. The cities of the world, and the word, the German word Bürger, the French word Bourg, or for city, bourgeois, were people who lived in cities etymologically. But that then, with Marx, became class politics and class economics. Nevertheless, the idea is that we can see how much cities are associated with income and markets and how much that weakens the feudal legacy. So in these debates, for instance, over income and the fact that people may live in downtown areas may be lower in income than in suburban areas. Ed Glaeser, in his book, The Triumph of the Cities, stresses, for instance, that that may be true, but that historically, for centuries, and globally today, poor people are still moving to cities. The one of the big visible themes stressed in the press right now, this is a story I saw on the news today. China is stressing poverty and trying to reduce the poverty within China. And the poverty levels I mean, the average income, they have some income numbers of maybe 3,000 annual income in dollars for an average, for some average small town rural people. By contrast, some numbers, I won't try to push this too far because this is harder to estimate, but the so-called The economic concept is called the reservation wage. How much would you have to pay? That is, what's the dollar equivalent of all the benefits you may get if you're able to be low in income and eligible for these and apply for these government programs. And they then argue that if you're trying to maximize your income, you shouldn't look for work if you're able to get more from the government subsidies than you are from working at a low, a low paid job in McDonald's. So the reservation wage, or the rough, yeah, estimated that way is sometimes is today roughly around $70,000. That is, you got to be paid $70,000 if you want to maximize you got to be paid more than $70,000, or if you want to maximize your income, you shouldn't apply for a job because you'll lose those benefits or some of those benefits. Okay, so the point is, China does not have a welfare state at all as developed as the US. But China is now actively pursuing this because it wants to reduce income. And so how much is race correlated with income or poverty and change in income? Okay, so one empirical finding then, which we discussed in City Money, is that you get very little, and many others have discussed, you get very little organization, or sorry, let me pause for a minute. Aurora, do you have a question, comment?
I did. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on when you were talking about the fact that poor people are still moving to cities. I didn't quite grasp why that is.
Okay, yeah. Well, the the bottom line of Ed Glaeser, and I'm illustrating it here with these examples of China. China has had massive migration from the small towns and rural areas to cities. And China is trying to change that, to have people go back to the small towns. And if they leave because they want to make more money in the cities, then it's harder for that to happen. So what China's doing right now is actively pursuing more than the US or most Western countries have done. Some Europeans have done this a little bit. The US has minimally done so. The US is more focused on individuals, of raising individuals' incomes rather than the income of the whole small, poor town. So in that sense, what Glaeser argues is that around the world and historically, poor people as individuals have moved to cities because they can do better economically, as well as other things that may not be narrow income maximization. But the reason you have these barrios around all the Latin American cities, the Chinese do not. They deliberately are trying to prevent the sort of Latin American or some of the African barrios. So what they've tried to do historically is say that you can't get the benefits. They're more limited than $70,000, but you can't get a lot of you can't go to some schools, you can't get some hospital rights and so forth benefits if you have a rural residential card. And they use those. I mean, those cards are big stuff in most of the world. You know, your passport or your identity card gives you lots of rights in ways that the American sort of conception is, we don't want to have any cards. We don't want to have anybody. We're a cowboy society. I mean, that still is here in COVID right now. I mean, people talk about lockdown. There's no lockdown in the US anywhere. It never has been, compared to the West Europeans or the Chinese or the Koreans or the Japanese. You know, you get a number, you got to apply. Can I go out and get to a grocery store and get some food? And if you don't get that okay over your computer, you can't go out. If you go out, you get arrested. We've never had anything like this. So the degree to which the US is different in that respect is that the US is much more individualized, and these programs, as Glaeser, for instance, did a controversial paper. So the solution to Katrina is not to try to fix Katrina or to try to restore it. Give the people benefits. Give individuals half the amount of money that we're spending and let them move to Houston or New York or wherever, and let them choose whether they want to spend that money in New Orleans and renovate New Orleans, or if they want to go elsewhere. And many other people said, that is destructive, and we shouldn't do that. But that was an exception to the general U.S. policy. Um, and basically, we have a combination of those programs going on. I mean, the foundations, the federal government did give a fair amount of aid to the city of New Orleans, but especially it then got controversially criticized. It's being used for clientelism, using people are doing payoffs, and so forth. And that in turn led Glazer to make this kind of argument. But he makes it mostly he makes it in the international context, that in India, in Latin America and Africa, you get massive migration to cities. And it's not that they're trying to get less benefits, it's because as individuals, they're doing better, and they have done historically better for that reason. Okay, so that's the classic argument for the 19th century onto present. I say 19th century, it happened in massive numbers. Or in the U.S., it had really happened in the 20th century, in the sense that the U.S. was something like almost 80+ % rural and farmer, and by the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, we got less than 10% who people who are really really small town and farmers. So the whole agricultural, we still are a cowboy society. We still think of the beauties of the rural areas, but there was a drastic transformation over the 20th century here, and the same kind of thing happened in different, and it happened faster in China. But okay, so I'm stressing, all right, so if we have this kind of rural urban Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, we then have many theories, such as those in the section in the readings from Theodorson, Burgess, Homer Hoyt. Why do cities grow and why do they get bigger? Urban as a way of life. Zimmel, Wirth, Herb Gans. These are the classic kinds of readings, and one of them, and these are some of the best. So some of the best minds writing and thinking about these when in their years. Zimmel's essay is considered one of the best, but his basic idea, and most of these authors do not say anything about subgroups. They don't talk about poor people and rich people within cities to a serious degree. They don't talk about gays within gay neighborhoods. They don't talk about ethnic minorities in a serious way. So what Claude Fisher then did, and what many of the readings here do, is to bring in how and why different subgroups or sub-processes do not fit the normal rural to urban pattern. And so I won't try to go through those right here. We'll bring in a little bit, but I want to let Gray talk, because he's been working seriously on gayborhoods, and this is this is still a relatively new issue in terms of, gays have been politically ignored by social scientists for the most part, and so to have some visible discussion of this, well, actually, just introduce the most visible urban finding among social scientists concerning gays was by Gary Gates and then Gates in Florida together. They had a finding in a paper, and then in Florida's book, the book that made him famous, called The Rise of the Creative Class, which showed that if you try to see which kinds of cities in the local areas, what they use. Now be careful, the unit does matter. They use metropolitan areas. There are about 1,000 metro areas in the US, 800 to 1,000, something like that. They use those, and they basically showed that the more unmarried men living together in a metro area, the faster the growth of high-tech jobs And basically the argument was the unmarried men living together at a time when it was not politically appropriate to talk about gays. And Gary Gates himself was a very visible gay activist and is now at UCLA doing gay studies and so forth. So he got special permission from the census to access some of their data at a and to get this before the census published these more generally. They don't ask a question about sexual preferences. They only ask about, so it was a crude measure, but it nevertheless was then used. In their basic finding was metro areas with more gays have more high-tech economic job growth. And so people said, that's crazy, that's impossible. You're saying gays are really are computer geeks and that's driving the whole big tech economy? And their answer was, no, we're not using gays to say this specific subgroup is the cause directly, but we're using gays as an indicator of tolerance. And that if a location has more gays, that implies it has more tolerance. And the classic example they and everyone uses was Silicon Valley contrasted with Boston, but then also they contrast with Pittsburgh and so forth. And this then was out there for about a year, and I can modestly say I was the first person to really, well, I call them up. I say, this is wild stuff. But the first question with any wild, new, interesting finding is, are you sure it's not a mistake? Did you make any errors? And as I said, did you test for things that may be associated with gays? Might it be spurious? I said, oh yeah, we tested and it's in the paper. I said, did you look at any other variables? I said, well yeah, some. I said, would you be able to share your data? So they said, oh, sure. So they sent me their raw data. And I took their data and found then I gave it to a research assistant, student here, PhD student. He used it for a year. I said, check if there's anything else that might be driving it. And I said, well, he said after about a year, almost all the findings are fit with their results. And I said, well, how about the ones that don't? Well, there are only a couple of those. I said, well, can I have the data myself? So I then worked on it myself for a month. And I found that if you include gays and the educational level of the metro area together, education suppresses the gay effect. So the driver was not gays, the driver was education. Okay, so I published this, circulated around. Ed Glazer then did another paper which showed the same basic thing. He called it human capital, but it was the same basic finding. And so so Rich Florida then has argued back and forth with us on this. But the basic finding, the basic point is that gays are important not only in their own right in that sense, but they are a potential indicator of other things. But just think simply, how well are percent gays in a metro area an indicator of tolerance? If we have so one thing I did in the paper was to pursue that avenue a little bit. So I got some measures from surveys which looked at the degree to which different cities in the US, citizens in different cities in the US said, we had some classic, the GSS and there's classic tolerance items. Would you permit a library would you encourage or favor a library to have a book written by a homosexual, an African-American, etc., persons from India? They're measures of ethnicity and of tolerance of different groups which have been developed, which are pretty standardized like that. Have a book in a library, have a neighbor who is of this background, invite one of these people to dinner. let your sister or your daughter marry one of these people, or encourage. I mean, I'm using the obviously the patriarchal, traditional, ironically, the language of the past in that sense. But the huge finding from when these surveys began, and the most classically studied items are like the ones I'm just citing to you. Sam Stauffer, people at NORC across the Midway, I mean, they pioneered in this, and there are hundreds and hundreds of studies and papers, thousands. This is the most, I mean, so tolerance of ethnicity, race, lifestyle is the most classically studied thing that we have. And it basically, I mean, most of these show a dramatic increase in tolerance from the 1930s, when a huge majority of people would say, no way, no way. I don't want anybody, I don't want these kinds of people to live nearby me, and so forth. By the, by 2000, by the 70s, that had drastically changed. That is, the amount of tolerance expressed, at least in these statements, had drastically increased. And so but the point is, we have big variations, and this is still visible in Donald Trump's opening splash, which made him in 2016 such a controversial candidate. Was, he said, Mexicans are rapists. I mean that obvious attack on Mexicans in that way, at least gave him huge publicity, and then so he basically has been leveraging that along with other things, and that in turn, as you see, has mobilized huge support for diversity efforts and concerns, which we have today, much more visible and central. Okay, so the point is, we have, let me make the quick critical point. How strongly does the survey item of tolerance relate to tolerance of individual African Americans or Black? The point is that just think of Chicago. Chicago is the most segregated city in the US in terms of race. We have separate neighborhoods for African Americans, for Poles, for Irish, in that to the degree that one might imagine, and we have on the so-called Boys Town a visible homosexual, gay, tolerant neighborhood, which has been there. The city then, linking with this arts idea in neighborhoods and the ethnicity of Chicago politics, put up banners, statues, and so forth all over the city. For instance, in Chinatown, they have Chinese traditional sculptures. In Greektown, same kind of thing. So when it came to, and this was daily too, so when it came to Boys Town, they said, we're going to put up some multicolored towers that will show that this is a gay neighborhood, and we want to show the visibility and the distinctiveness of pride of this neighborhood. They held public hearings. Lots of people came out and said, I've been living here for 5 years, but my grandmother doesn't know that I'm gay, and I don't want her to come and visit and see these things right outside my apartment. I'm gonna have trouble. Don't put up those statues. So the city said, oh, come on, this is Chicago. We celebrate ethnicity, we celebrate lifestyle. Gays are just another ethnic group, was the Chicago answer to that, which is the opposite of sort of the Ed Glazer treat people as an individual, not as a collective neighborhood characteristic. So so probably many of the people who didn't want their grandmothers to know about their lifestyle moved out. Others, however, moved in this gayborhood, as it has come to be called, was visible, strong, most celebrated in a gay pride parade. And even Daley too, when the first year he was elected, he marched in the gay parade. So he made the point that he was not against gays. He was celebrating, he was marching in the gay pride parade in ways that, and at the beginning, it was more visibly, I would say, militant, active, dynamic, shouting, people cheering, and it still exists. There's still the parade, but it's become much more sedate, much more calm. But this is all background, giving you some social science and a little bit of linkage in the case of Chicago for Gray to talk about the theories of the gayborhood. And let me turn it over to Gray to Gray, unless anybody has a question on what I've said before we go to Gray. Sorry, let me, okay, go ahead. Gray, it's your show for a while.
Cool, thank you. I guess I'm going to start by outlining what I intend to do with this quote unquote mini lecture. I kind of want to talk about how the 5 major themes of this course have played into the development of the gayborhood broadly, based on some examples that I have here based on my research, and then delve into a case study based on my work in Philadelphia, where I was in graduate school before coming to Chicago. And then I will follow this by kind of an analysis talking about the decline of the gay neighborhood through an evaluation of elements that make up of the scenescapes, applying this to Chicago, as Professor Clark just said, to the gayborhood, or in Chicago, Boys Town. Now I think they're renaming it North Halsted or something like that. And then finally, I hope to leave some time for questions if there are any after that. But starting with gayborhoods, I kind of want to talk about why the gayborhoods came to be where they were based on the 5 elements of this course, and talking about it through the lens of, not just one of these, but through the combination of all of them. Taking some examples that I'm most familiar with to work on. I've worked New York, Philly, Chicago, LA, Washington, DC, and San Francisco, to name a few. And people have argued for many gayborhoods came to be for many reasons. If we took the lens of urban development and leadership, for example, we can see in Philadelphia, in New York, and some other areas, gayborhoods developed as slums and tenement houses were cleared away, where single men took up residence in the mid-century because they had expendable incomes and were not buying up houses in the suburbs, but rather investing in this cheap real estate down in the center, downtown. If we take another view for markets, which is pretty close across all urban areas in major gayborhoods in the post-war era, this is linked again to leadership as well and policies. There's federal funding for straight folks who had served in the military after World War II to leave the city, through the GI Bill to build in the suburbs, and so they could purchase these homes in the suburbs, but who stayed behind benefited from cheaper rent prices. And so we see this in places like New York, Philly, San Francisco, or other places where gayborhoods started popping up with cheap rents. Of course, this is tied again to urban development, gentrification, and other themes that we've talked about broadly in this course. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention urban innovation. This is particularly key for cities that had larger cities and gay scenes. And I think I've written about this in papers and talks before, and my work on gay bathhouses, as I've mentioned, that larger urban areas, as previously mentioned, came to be seen as socialized space that had places for gay individuals, which were kind of like seen as gay utopias. So they were places for gay men and some lesbians to create connections in baths and bars and parks and theaters. So the increased invisibility of these gay communities led to greater migration to urban areas because of like what have people and different authors across sexuality research has called the gay utopia. So gays and lesbians use these institutions as social anchors to form friendships, meet partners, and really create their own identity. And if we're talking about themescapes, then I think it's key to think about artists, the leisure class, the bohemian, as we've talked about, the flaneur, thinking that gay men who were seen as maybe oddities or the odd men out kind of socialize with, or could feel more comfortable or less unique or different if they were in these areas that were more welcoming to artists. Particularly, this is seen at the turn of the century and work by George Chauncey in New York, and then sometimes in places like the BDSM community in San Francisco. And I think if we think about more contextualization and historically, we can see these, all three of these in Philadelphia, which I'll get into because I studied neighborhoods there. But in particular, if we talk about the anchor institution of the Gay Bathhouse, I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. But those are just kind of broadly speaking across the United States, kind of some of what I've seen. But if I use Philly as an example, I take the position, and I have for a long time, that the Gayborhood in Philly, which is called the Gayborhood, unlike in Chicago, it's called the Boys Town. There's other names for different neighborhoods across the US. I take the position that it was both economic, political, and social that helped form the Gayborhood. Before World War II, there were formal communities that were making up this community alongside the gay spaces existed in the city, where there was working class artists and Black communities. These marginalized communities provided a place for homosexuals, like as I mentioned, to feel free, to avoid social control. So this is in the 1920s. So the hotels and theaters along what is in Philadelphia's Broad Street, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Philadelphia's geography. There's this entertainment district where gay men could often be found, and because they were subject to violence and harassment and policing elsewhere, they found that they could exist in these spaces with a degree of freedom. With social changes and circumstances after World War II, in Philadelphia and other places, the formation of the modern gay neighborhood is something that we begin to see. During World War II, we saw mass mobilization of Americans during the war, upending social norms, exposing young Americans to kind of a diversity that they had not seen before in their social isolation in their rural communities. And this is kind of getting to kind of the classic tradition of thinking about urban migration, urbanism in the classic context that plays into this. But after the war, we see homosexuals make home in less reputable commercial areas, especially in Philadelphia. This would be, I don't know, again, how many of you are familiar with it, but there are these side streets called Juniper and Camac streets, where kind of some of the earliest gay establishments were. And again, these post-war economic and political forces that barred gays and homosexuals from the mainstream American culture allowed homosexuals to establish communities in cities, particularly in Philadelphia. We had these federal dollars targeting projects that were synonymous with, white, middle, heterosexual families. So we had the federal highway projects that facilitated the exodus of the middle class from the city, away for creating a property value to collapse. We had consumerism that was boosted by the GI Bill and other subsidies, and so we had what was left in the cities. I view, especially in Philadelphia, the Black, poor, iconoclasts, and gays left in this downtown area, and so marginalized and clustered in low-rent area. They were able to find, gays were able to find social acceptance. And so they socialized in these gay spaces, finding connections, as I said, in baths, and bars, parks, and theaters with these increased visibility, and able to meet friends and partners and all kinds of things. And this continued through the 20th century. And neighborhoods expanded through sexual liberation, again, a social movement, which would allow them to create social institutions that were politicized because of sexual identity. So between the 1950s and 1970s, we saw Philadelphia's neighborhood saw boom in the number of businesses. We saw clubs and baths and bookstores and restaurants and coffee houses and community centers created for this particular sexual identity, and other gathering spaces making up this social scene. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but there's Giovanni's Room, there's a Venture Inn, there's a Bike Stop, Allegra. These are all the kind of very iconic institutions in Philadelphia. And we had other ones that were not so famous that were popped up for a brief period of time or relocated and closed. But again, these places didn't exist without some fears of policing and government interference. And in some ways, the city tried to interfere with this through planning practices where development the city tried to raise some of these areas and for development and try to clean these spaces up, which jeopardized some of the housing and social status of these. So while urban renewal in Philadelphia constricted the gay communities, they were further constricted by, unfortunately, in the 1980s and 90s, with the outbreak of HIV and AIDS in Philadelphia, the gay neighborhood just collapsed. As people who owned the gay spaces passed away, these gay ownership decreased. Some of the spaces that were owned at the height of the sexual revolution were no longer part of the community, and the boundaries continued to shrink until a resurgence in the 2000s, as we saw a social acceptance of LGBT communities. We've recently started to see a building up of this space again. However, the growth remains tenuous, especially, I don't know, in Center City, Philadelphia, which borders the neighborhood. We see what I will get into is a kind of straight watching due to gentrification, where development is endorsed by city planners and politicians of these formerly gay institutions and are incentivized to develop there because they are marketed as gay, but how gay and authentically gay they are is up for debate, especially the sanctuary space that they offered this community is losing its sense of familiarity with the gay community. And so that kind of makes me want to shift a little bit and talk about now if we understand the construct of the neighborhood, what has allowed it to come into being in a certain place based on these 5 course themes, then how can we understand this, how it has changed and what it presently looks like today. So if we look at the neighborhood and recent works, I don't know if you were familiar, but I'll tell you, Amin Ghazianides, he has a book called There Goes the Neighborhood. He documents the shifting reality where neighborhood lies historically and where it is in reality where LGBT people live. And I would argue that, again, the politics, social acceptance has allowed, and he argues as well, allowed for the dispersal of the LGBT folks so that being gay or lesbian and trans is less taboo and more societally acceptable, normal is his argument, that has allowed folks to live outside the bounds of this neighborhood. So in this sense, the character and the composition of these neighborhoods, while formerly inhabited exclusively by artists and young professionals and gay and lesbian folks, now is less so, and we're seeing an influx of young working professionals who are straight take up residence in this place because it's seen as a cool, unquote, cool place to live. So if we think about Chicago's Boys Town, this was the first place in the country to be demarcated, as Professor Clark said, by these rainbow pylons, which are these statues that we see in Chicago's Boys Town. But to the degree the fact that that place is still seen as gay is up for debate. And that is in fact still shifting, where we are seeing places in Chicago like Andersonville, Edgewater, Ravenswood, Logan Square, as people who are in the community being the LGBTQ community, are seen as much more gay or queer than Boys Town is necessarily. So it's an important part of the relationship to the course then is to think about how innovation and culture drives the change in the city, even down to the local level. So if we talk about in terms of scenescapes, then I would leads me to question the authenticity and the legitimacy of the neighborhood in terms of traditionalism, expressiveness, glamour, the homogeneity, the locality, and corporateness, to name a few. And I put that through questioning, do we think about the corporate aspect of authenticity? I think about all the rainbow trans stickers that stores and businesses put up in the windows, or the gender neutral bathrooms that are in these places. They offer these things to appeal to a certain people, but whether or not actual LGBT people frequent these or employed at these or own these businesses is up for debate. This goes hand in hand with amenities. So if we think about gay bars, bathrooms, and other places, or sorry, bathhouses and other places, where they are is an indicator of how authentic that place is. So in Chicago and Philadelphia, you see that we can map these places. We can map the bars, we can map the baths, we can map the adult sex stores that cater to LGBTQ folks, and where they are nowadays fall outside the bounds of where these cities have demarcated as the neighborhoods. So how authentic can a neighborhood or Boys Town be in Philadelphia, the neighborhood in Philadelphia and the Boys Town here in Chicago. B, if the stores that are quote unquote meant for these sexual minorities are not even located within the geographic region. So I think Ghaziani and other urban scholars at sexuality again have argued that neighborhoods are associated with this trend setting and this prestige of living in an area, but what does that mean if it's not really a neighborhood or a gay neighborhood anymore? So I'm going to leave you with that and see if you have any questions based on that brief mini lecture that I've tossed out there.
That's great, Gray. Thank you much. Questions or comments?
I have a question. It's really interesting to listen to this presentation, and something that you did mention it, but I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit on it, is you were mentioning that, you know, these different areas have been given a name that really explains the status of the neighborhood. And I wanted to ask you how you think that has impacted integration and a status of inclusivity in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's actually a very fascinating question, and I don't know how aware you are. So I'm just going to talk about Chicago since that's kind of where I am now and kind of like the politics that I'm paying attention to. But recently, the name of the neighborhood in Chicago has been up for debate. It's called Boys Town, or has historically been called Boys Town. And there has recently been pushed to change the name of Boys Town, I think to, Andy might be able to help me out with this, I don't know, North Halsted or something like that. So under the push for making it a more inclusive space. So Boys Town, a lot of the people within and outside of the LGBT community say, you know, this is a space that caters to gay men mostly, and mostly gay white men of a certain class status, being upper middle class. So, but we want it to be a more inclusive area. We want more people from the South Side to feel welcome, people from the West Side to feel welcome. We want lesbians to come. We want trans individuals to feel comfortable. So in order to do that, in making that gesture, let's change the name from the Boys Town to North Halsted or whatever. There are people, however, in the community who say by changing the name of Boys Town to North Halsted or whatever it's going to be, you are in fact you're not even making it more inclusive, you're erasing the community, period. By calling it Boys Town, you're not even making a nod to the community that once was there. You're just erasing the fact that there's any LGBT community at all by just giving it a generic name. So in attempts to making it more inclusive, you're denying the fact there is any LGBT community here in Chicago at all. Is that helpful?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Other questions?
Would you want to mention the one theme which was more recently stressed by the author of the book on the neighborhood, about the ways that gay men might get together, which could be in the street, having, or in these institutions that you have stressed, the bars, I mean, and that with their specific sometimes names, bars, clubs, bookstores, etc. Second could just be walking in the street. But third, how might gays, or not just gays, might other minority or special interest groups or lifestyle defined groups get together, which I don't think you stressed as much, but maybe you could add a few words on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is something that has been actually written about more recently. I was kind of doing some reading in between Monday and Wednesday, and I think I had briefly mentioned on Monday that, you know, gays and lesbians and LGBT folks used to go to these neighborhoods seeking interactions with each other, and so they know they could go to this space where they would find other gay men or lesbians or whatever they were looking for. And there were these guides that were giving out. They were called Dameron guides, you could say. They were like little pocket books. I think there was a movie recently about the Green Book in the South or something like that, where people knew were safe places to go. Similar kind of situation with gay men would have these kind of places where you could go. That's in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now we have these apps, and we have the internet, and we have all these things that have allowed that you can just pull out of your pocket, and you can find, because a lot of these apps are geographically based, you can find someone who's queer next to you and go socialize with them in that circumstance. And so you don't necessarily need to have this geographic meeting space to come together to meet up. And that has actually been kind of the basis of several articles, in particular focusing on Washington, D.C., where a lot of, where one scholar, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, has argued that the decline of the gay bathhouses in Washington, D.C. is due to, in part, because of apps such as Grindr, Tinder, whatever else, Scruff, used by the LGBTQ community, where you used to go to the baths, and that was a place to one, find hookups, but also to have the social community to really like celebrate your identity, has shifted from one locale to an online platform.
And more specifically, that this is generalized to other ethnic and lifestyle groups,
right?
In ways that these have even been sometimes in this Chicago, this celebrated city, or the city of celebration for ethnicity, treats not only gays but also cyclists. So the bicycle associations of Illinois have gotten lots of money from foundations and other places, including the federal government. And they're people who are basically hired and who work in City Hall in Chicago, who are paid by, or at least the funds come not from the taxpayers of Chicago. They come from bicycle associations, and the federal government money earmarked specifically for bicycles. So they go out, they bike around, they do counts of the number of bikes in different streets and where to try to increase them or decrease them. They try to make intersections safer for bikes. And they go to public meetings where people say, you're taking out one full car lane on Martin Luther King Drive and you're giving it over to bicycles. You're going to increase traffic for people with cars. Should you be doing this? And I've been to some of these meetings myself, and I've been amazed at how aggressive the bicycle proponents are and how much the city under Rahm Emanuel really went along with them. So it was a huge increase under Daley in part. I mean, Daley himself was a cyclist, and the city under Daley too got many awards as being the most bicycle-friendly city in the United States. But that I'm using this as an example of how things can be transformed using civic organizations, apps, and then either the partial embrace or in the case of letting the civic groups have that kind of impact. And I contrast this with the main European or Chinese, Asian examples where the government is much more openly, directly, and centrally involved in policy or cultural policy. Here you tend to have a messy mix of private and public and civic and foundations and contributions of people on boards who get a tax benefit for contributing to a nonprofit, etc. But these processes are not uniquely applicable to gays. They also work for other, and I'm stressing here, of course, the lifestyle organizations, in addition to the classic race, class, gender, national origin, age, which have been stressed for a long time, but also especially since, say, the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King. So several of the readings in these later sections look at individual cases, and some follow the strong racial story, such as the Douglas Mathey paper and book with the same title, American Apartheid. So basically saying, this is South Africa. We have a closed, rigid, race-dominated society. But then the follow-up point, which we have in which you've heard me say before, is if we look at these comparatively and try to measure the degree to which race, class, gender, national origin explain bicycling, explain frequenting gay neighborhoods, it explain shopping in, and I read you the list from the Cities and Entertainment Machine of that correlation matrix, but you can do the same thing. Just look at any social science journal which lists something like the adjusted R squared, and that tells you how much of the variance is explained by those factors, and the answer is about 10%. If you get a very low N, a low number of cases, in some situations, it can be higher. But that's a general pattern with a large N. So the point of this story of that is, I also found in looking, I was surprised myself, the degree to which there's a conflict between the media story and what, if you look at some of the actual data. So when I was working on these things and found, for instance, most Blacks are not poor and most poor are not Black. Hey, most Blacks are not poor in the sense that most African Americans are well above the poverty line, and most poor in the US are not Black in the sense that many of them are white, some are Mexican, but they're very strongly majority Caucasian, poor. But in this way, these individual cases, most poor, not Blacks, most Blacks are not poor, illustrates the same general point that statistically, the degree to which poverty is explained by race is not that strong. And then so what we're then getting with what Gray has presented is not just the descriptive numbers, most poor are not Blacks and most Blacks are not poor. That's a simple descriptive number, but that doesn't say why. And so, I mean, what are the causes of poverty, and how are these things changing, or what are the, how can we have better public services? This is what we get in many of the readings. So Bill Wilson, for instance, is a book on the reading list, The Truly Disadvantaged, has got, okay, but now before I go on that, is anybody else, I think, are you still there, Gray?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, you're still there. I was just gonna say, does anyone else have something specifically for Gray and specifically about gays before I talk more generally? Anything, or any ways of taking the specific analysis which he has given to us and linking it with anything else in the course or anything else you personally are working on? Okay. One point I'm just say it again in a slightly different way from what Gray did. He mentioned the apps of where you may be able to find individuals who you did not know in advance were gay, but you may find them and identify and start. And so this is I mean much, but obviously this is much more general. There's all kinds of social media, dating, looking for friends, looking for people to do things together. And so that's obviously more well known and more generalizable than just gays. More specifically, one of the big themes in the book, on the Gayborhood, is that if you have friends, say 4 friends who say, let's get together for dinner, they can email and meet in a restaurant in a downtown area, which is not a Gayborhood at all. They can sit in a table where they may be dressed in a dark blue suit or or a t-shirt or whatever else, but they may not be in any visible way looking like or acting gay, and this of course is much more generalizable as well, that people may have special interests which lead them to want to get together socially or for lifestyle or political lobbying or fundraising kinds of purposes. And I'll just add in quotes, briefly in parentheses, gays are among the most politically active and financially active in the United States. I mean, there have become a number of laws which have really helped gays, and places like Hollywood, New York, so forth, San Francisco, there's some people who are in Chicago, there's some very affluent gays who are, funding a number of organizations and activities which are very important. The Harold Washington was close to a number of these things, for instance. So what I'm stressing then is it's something to watch, remember, and take away from this is that African Americans, for instance, you can use as a primordial group, you can adapt some of these same mechanisms. So you can say, let's have an African American or let's have a Mexican dinner in a high-end, generally not specifically African American neighborhood or African American restaurant, but let's have 4 African Americans get together and talk about how we can raise more money for Black Lives Matter. But we don't have to do that in Bronzeville. We can go to the north side. And that's been happening. I live in Bronzeville, and Friday, Saturday night for the last 20 years, if you're a cool, active, outgoing young man or young woman, on Friday, Saturday night, you're not in Bronzeville. You go to the north side, and there are clubs all over the north side, some of them in a neighborhoods, others where you have clubs that are in intermediate areas, such as around Lake Street there, where you can have a club that on Friday night, or let's say on one Friday night, they'll play house music. On another Friday night, they'll play hip hop. That is, you'll have changes in the style of music that are partially attracting a socially distinct audience. And so house music has sometimes been defined as more gay oriented. But I've talked, for instance, to the bouncers or the guys at the door checking your ID, and I said, well, what proportion of house music people in the audience would you guess are actually gay? I said, or what proportion? I guess some have said that okay, that all right. So let me not push too much, but his guesstimate would be maybe 30-40%. That is, you don't, even if you have music or a lifestyle defined activity which may be thought of as distinctly gay, it doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the audience is gay. On the other hand, sometimes, and I've had students write papers on this, because they'll go to, say, some of the clubs where you have black say talk shows with jokes, and there may be a white person in the audience from a white USC student has gone to the club, and the talk show host may say, "What are you doing here?" So you can have a singling out of people who are not one of the primordially defined members. And so you can have, in these mechanisms of either critiquing or supporting different individuals, a shift in the makeup of the point I'm making is the culture and the rules of the game. If you say culture can be defined as values and rules of the game and sort of an ideology, these things can shift the way and the meaning, the ways and the meaning that gay or African American or lesbian operates. This was also illustrated, as I've mentioned, in the book and the paper on the reading list, by the 4 lesbian towns, which range from Portland, Maine to California, and where the lifestyle, the culture of lesbians drastically change from place to place. So the fact that you may be gay or lesbian does not define necessarily how you dress, how you act, how you look. That there are many different subtypes, and they can be enhanced by these mechanisms such as bars, but also more individualized by cell phones. So you can have you can have 2 friends meeting and say, let's meet for dinner, and let's dress in a wild way, or we can dress in maybe men, or we can dress as women, let's see if we can meet each other as women and see if anybody notices, and let's go to such and such a restaurant. That is, you can do all different combinations, creating them yourselves, enhanced by cell phone individualized linkages, and you don't need the neighborhood to do that, is the point. Or put differently, more people are doing these things, and the bottom line, we may not have, well, yeah, Gray did mention it briefly, but I'll just underline it again. The underlying title of the book, isn't it, The Decline of the Neighborhood? That is, neighborhoods in American cities are in decline in the last 10 to 20 years. Not because, and Gray said this said this quickly, but let me just underline it again. Probably because there's so much acceptance, there's so much welcoming, and so much decline of intolerance that gay men don't need to live in a separate neighborhood. They don't need to, and so the lifestyle. If you look at the not all of you know the names of most. That's just, most of you are not from Chicago. Most of you don't know what those neighborhood names mean. But if you bike around, look at them, they don't look gay at all. I mean, they look like normal, quote, north side, lakefront, elegant apartment buildings in the areas that are now the highest in Uptown and north of Uptown on the lakefront is one of the, if not the number one area with the highest. About 4 or 5 years ago, it became the highest proportion of gays were in that neighborhood. And you'd have no idea that this was the case by biking by it or walking around it. So in that sense, there are many gays who no longer are living in neighborhoods, but more generally, how much is this happening? And how much does this relate with or interrelate with the primordial and these lifestyle differences, and how much does it vary one by one? So this is what now people are studying and finding. These things are they're not insignificant, but each one tends to be much smaller than the people who are the very aggressive advocates of the one or the other. And some of this got championed and led by, I'm just looking here with Gray and I talked about this. In the same city that he studied of Philadelphia, there was a famous study, or two famous books there were by people who've worked on this. Elijah Anderson did a book called The Cosmopolitan Canopy, Race and Civility in Everyday Life. So it's a general title, but his basic point was that there were certain places, certain institutions in Philadelphia where if you were a black man, you were a couple, and the man was white and the woman was black, and et cetera, there were places you could go and be welcomed and comfortable. And in a sense, it was a cosmopolitan canopy. And his implicit point is most of Philadelphia was not that welcoming. In Chicago, you have, for instance, as well, walking on the lakefront. I mean, I bike on the lakefront sometimes. You look in the summer on nice days and I'd say 10 years ago, there were lots of couples that were mixed race couples, visibly holding hands, walking together. Now that's much less true. But when it was still sort of cutting edge, walking on the lakefront was seen as a cosmopolitan canopy in Chicago. Another related book, again on Philadelphia, is by Frederick Wherry, Wherry, called The Philadelphia Barrio, The Arts, Branding, and Neighborhood Transformation. And it's on the main Puerto Rican neighborhood, which was seen as a drug, crime-ridden, dangerous, rundown neighborhood that the police were always on the edge, and people were worried about going there. I mean, the guidebooks did not say to go there at all. And so Wherry, who's a professor now of sociology at Princeton, who's African American, he studied the Puerto Rican neighborhood because it's a model, he felt implicitly, for African Americans, of how they could renovate and transform African American neighborhoods using the arts and branding, and transform the neighborhood away from being a poor black, a poor, um, negatively defined neighborhood into one of the main tourist sites of Philadelphia today. So the general guidebooks for out-of-town visitors will stress, come here and you can see these. And so they have, for instance, a tour bus where they have guys playing the guitar, singing songs in Spanish, Puerto Rican songs. Because Alejandro is here, I'm pointing out the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans in American cities often disagree and challenge each other, but they have a very specifically Puerto Rican style of dressing up little girls for parades with beautiful hairstyles and coloring, and the mothers just do a terrific job. And these were as in Chicago, these were really done for the pride and the locality of the ethnic members themselves. But they did it so well with such success that they would bring in people from other neighborhoods and visitors from out of town who would say, hey, this is great stuff. And so he writes the book on the Philadelphia barrio as an African-American, and then talking about, sometimes explicitly, about how this is different from what it would be if we're African-American. So the point is, he's playing up how you can take these traditional social categories and using the arts or culture or norms and transforming norms in different directions can redefine from bad to good in a way that drives the neighborhood not only to be successful, but to attract visitors. So in that sense, the Philadelphia the barrio is the opposite story from the gayborhood. But I would make the more general point that even if the one dynamic of the author of the gayborhood book, I mean, it's not as if they're no longer gay neighborhoods, they're still there. They may have gone down a bit, but we don't want to overgeneralize and say this is going to destroy all gayborhoods. These are, but what I'm trying to point to are, as you've heard me say 100 times, multi-causality. Many processes are going on simultaneously. And if we look more closely at lots and lots of gayborhoods, or lots and lots of bohemian neighborhoods, or lots and lots of Black neighborhoods, there are lots and lots of variations, just as if you talk to people, and that's one of the things I've mostly learned in decades of living in Bronzeville. They're all different kinds of African Americans in terms of politics, civic engagement, Black Lives Matter, looting. I mean, all these things are going on, but people are arguing about them and disagreeing in ways that don't often get presented in the more general public. Okay. Any comments on any of these themes of how to join the pieces that we've seen throughout the course in particular? And so there, as I say, there are many examples of these in the specific readings. Why don't we? Yeah. Okay. Can whoops 520? Oh yeah, 520. Yeah, we got time. But let's look at the Claude Fisher video, please. As he's a major theorist at Berkeley who's been working on related issues for his whole career. And he did a book on the telephone, an early version of the cell phone.
Reason, which is not a reason necessarily why I entered the field, but a reason why I think it's important.
Can you make it louder?
Is the way to put it. Which is, I think that the topics in urban sociology, at least the ones I've been interested in, address major themes in classical sociology. And those themes, I think, refer a lot to the question of what happened in the transition from so-called traditional Western society to modern Western society. And the great theorists, Barks and Weber and Durkheim.
Max volume is still not very loud. Andy.
It is as loud as I can go, unfortunately.
Okay, that's fine. So that's one big point which he's making. Let's go ahead to the second section where we get the main point of how and why. So the main big theme he writes about is transforming the simple rural to urban dynamic and making it more subtle, and how? This is what he's famous for.
Is that a particular characteristic of a large settlement pattern is that it provides a wide range of social options within a relatively narrow geographical area. So that individuals, in assessing whether they're going to turn to their neighbors for advice or help or social activity, have in a smaller community pattern essentially a little more limited range of choice, in a larger community a wider range of choice. That will, in the long run, lead more people to disattend to their neighbors. Now, I think that what network analysis does is provide a very concrete mechanism for analyzing why such a change would occur, as opposed to what I think previously existed, which was some sort of loose, mechanistic kind of an idea that there was something about the size or the stimulation or whatever of urban life that made people alienated and alone and therefore destroyed neighbor relations. A network analytical perspective, I think, makes you look much more closely at what are the specific ways in which people are building social ties, and then to say, but the ways they build those ties may end up being different in a small community than a large community. And in fact, my own empirical research, including the latest study I did, does show that people in urban settings are less likely to be involved with their neighbors than people in small town settings, but not because they lack social ties, but precisely because they are making social connections at further distances than just next door. Now,
okay, that's his big finding. His last sentence stated it very clearly. That is, and I see this with especially African-American mothers. You may be an African-American 40-year-old woman. You may have 3 children and you may work full time. Who takes care of your children? Your sister, your aunt, your grandmother, not the man. You don't know, he may have got, you may who know where he is, but they're women who have very close connections. You heard as well the statement of finding from Forrest Stewart in the last session we had, that young African Americans use the internet twice as much as do whites, comparable whites. Similarly, what Claude Fisher showed 20, 30, 40 years ago when he's initially in his books on telephones before they had cell phones, different ethnic and different social groups within different cities can create and have created close ties or maintain those ties between the grandmothers, the aunts, and the sisters, not necessarily living in the same household, but enough to say, can Johnny stay with you for this afternoon from 3 to 5 because I'm going to be working until 5 today, as I do, and this may be done, every day for the whole year. Johnny gets out of class at 3. I don't get home from work until after 6 because I'm working until 5. Grandma, can you take care of him? And then grandma will say, fine. But then on one week when she can't, she calls another sister. Those kinds of connections and strong supports of taking care of children, shopping, celebrating things together. Those are the classic Gemeinschaft, small town personal relations, which have not, and what Fisher showed in reviewing a lot of other studies and in doing his own research, was these remain strong in many big cities, and they were missed by, say, a Louis Wirth, a Georg Simmel, the people on the reading list that we're critiquing here as having too overgeneralized a theory that the city, the Simmel-Wirth argument is the cities become cold, impersonal, people are super individualized, they do things on their own, and it doesn't separate out neighborhoods and specific kinds of connections which can be discovered if you look. And so that's what in his famous book was called To Dwell Among Friends. And so he shows how many people using mostly US data have done this. At the same time, you can be rural and cosmopolitan. So you get this in the Brian Turner book, The Cosmopolitan Virtue, Loyalty in the City, that you can live in Telluride, Colorado, on a mountaintop. You can live in Boulder, Colorado. You can live in a Berkeley, and so I'm citing not most visibly the college towns that you know about, the Berkeleys, the Ann Arbors, the Cambridge, the Austin, Texas. These places attract lawyers, writers, artists, and others. Santa Barbara, and these are among the most global and cosmopolitan places in the world, and but they're not big. And that's Claude Fisher's point. They don't need to be big cities, but you can have a combination of lifestyles in different rural and urban locations. The European example, well, so there are ways of both measuring and analyzing this, but the point is, it was capturing these many things that led us, or seeing these many things, which led us to develop the concept of scene, that the old traditional concept of neighborhood or of rural urban is just much too simple. And so we've got all these other things going on, and how can we, instead of just saying, you know, Santa Barbara is different from Ventura, why and how or gays are different from blacks, why and how and where will enhance one or the other. And so the cell phone can be one dynamic, a government subsidy can be another, like the veterans subsidies for housing in the suburbs, etc. But how can we put these together and make more sense? We try to do this in the Scenescapes book in ways that these can be looked at in China, in Argentina, in Nigeria, as well as in Chicago. And we've gotten consulting contracts, as I said, we won the consulting contract with the city of Paris for 3 years, 2 years with the city of Seoul. And then we had 350,000 launching the Scenes Academy in China a couple of months ago. So these are hot issues internationally, and the visibility, the centrality of ethnicity, and the fact that aldermen and my own aldermen have come to class and talked about this stuff for decades, makes Chicago a wonderful place to study these things, because it's not politically incorrect to talk about ethnicity or race or gender or other kinds of things. So enjoy it, celebrate it, and don't be embarrassed to take it back to your relatives in Palo Alto or Telluride or Coral Gables, because these things may be going on, but they're just not talked about so explicitly there. And that's why I came to Chicago in the first place, because it was such a terrific place to study these things, and why this has been the lead center of urban research for 100 years. Okay. Michael Deere challenged that in the reading, which I've mentioned, but we're at the end of our hour, so we will quit for now and stay on a little bit if anyone has some quick questions. But we will have to then we'll continue. We'll have a session on the arts and other things a bit on Monday, and next Wednesday we'll have a review for the exam. No, I'm sorry, not next week. Next week is Thanksgiving, so then there are no classes next week. So the week after next, we'll have Monday and Wednesday in that way. I think that's what the university has shifted toward. Does that match what you've seen as well, Andy and Gray?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you all. Feel free to post any comments if you have second thoughts or questions to Gray, to me, to Andy, and we'll watch what you may want to post. Gray has set up stuff on Canvas, I'll just mention, to make it more. A couple of you tried to post and it wasn't easy. He set it up so you can now post on Canvas more visibly, and it's a way to participate if you want to learn more and improve your grade and be in social contact with other people in the class, as Gray talked about doing. Okay.